Coming up is another fine product from Word in Your Ear. If you'd like to help, go to patreon.com/wordinyourear. For now, on with the show.
Welcome to another edition of Word in Your Ear. Now, is there a sadder story in the entire history of pop music than that of Karen Carpenter? I honestly don't think there is. And this new memoir, Lead Sister, is a fantastic insight into the band dynamics and into what its real life was like on the inside of one of the most enormous success stories of the 1970s. And it's an absolute heartbreaker. And it's the work of Lucy O'Brien. Lucy, it's lovely to see you.
It's lovely to see you. Thank you for inviting me.
Not at all. Where are you? Where do we find you?
Oh, so I'm northwest London and I'm in my loft and I can see Wembley Arch of the...
Oh, fantastic. Yeah. Oh, very exciting. Very good. Well, look, where to start? I mean, you say in the book, I think you were 9 when you first heard the Carpenters. What impression did you get of their music and of the kind of impossibly gorgeous America, actually, that they wrote about?
So, 2 things, really. Just give me a cough. I remember seeing Rainy Days and Mondays, and it was a video, and there was this female drummer, and she was singing at the same time, and I thought she looked really cool. I thought, well, that looks like a really good thing to do. That's there was something very inspiring about that. And then I just got into, as we know, that through the 70s, as the hits racked up, we saw and heard the Carpenters pretty much daily on the radio, and they came over to play live. I was a bit young to see them, but I remember they captured this idea of America that, going back then, England seemed very cold and grey, and there was something about America that the Carpenters represented: eternally blue skies, beautiful sunshine, like big wide cars, and the sound to match it, something very, very lush, and something really inspiring too. So those very strong memories associated with the Carpenters.
And where does the title come from? Just we should ask that. These Lead Sister.
Yeah, so Lead Sister. Funnily enough, they were very big in Japan, and a Japanese magazine, it was a typo, where instead of saying lead singer Karen Carpenter, they put lead sister Karen Carpenter. And she really liked that. And then she had a special T-shirt made with Lead Sister slogan on. So on their 76 World Tour, when she did her big drumming solo, she would wear her T-shirt. So I thought it would just seem like a nice...
No, it's a great title.
So talking about the brother-sister thing, obviously it's brother-sister act, it starts as. Wasn't one of the things you keep returning to throughout the book? He was the chosen one, wasn't he? Is that fair to say? Tell us a bit about that.
Yeah, so he was like the anointed one. Definitely Agnes Carpenter, who was their mother, he was definitely her favourite. And I had a really interesting interview with Nicky Chin, one of her former boyfriends, the wonderful glam rock producer, songwriter, who said that one thing that Karen opened up about was she really felt keenly that favoritism, and that really affected her, the way Richard was seen as the genius in the family, and she felt that she'd been overlooked from quite a young age, even though she played ball and she was very polite about his contributions to the band, and she was very respectful. There was a way in which she felt she had to fight for attention.
But also that relationship was oddly turned upside down, wasn't it? Because as far as the public was concerned, she was the star.
Yes, there was that too. People loved her voice and definitely did see her as the star. But she had a deep insecurity about her talent. And obviously that has roots in a lot of family issues that went way back. But I find it very interesting that someone like John Lennon, for instance, met met her and said, I think you've got I can't do a Liverpool accent, but, said, I think you've got
Try.
the most wonderful voice, love. And she was like, oh, wow. A Beatle has said he really likes my voice, but she just couldn't quite take it on. She couldn't believe that she was really that distinctive.
She didn't start as a singer, did she? So she only came to the fore gradually. Is that true?
Yes, that's right. So her first love was drumming, and she was an instrumentalist. And I love exploring that side of her story. She went from the high school marching band to persuading her parents to buy her this brand new drum kit. And she's like 15, 16 years old, whacking the drums, practicing day in, day out, listening to Joe Morello drumming and just copying it. And with this incredible sort of fierce dedication. So in a sense, that was where she felt most comfortable. That was her identity as a musician.
It's very unusual, though, isn't it, for a Californian girl, at the time of the Beach Boys and everything that was happening there, the psychedelic rock, and she's listening to these bebop drummers. Yes. And how did that happen? How was she getting access to that stuff? Was that through Richard, or was it through the kind of jazz that the trio were playing, or what?
Yeah, so it was a combination of things. Their father, Hal Carpenter, was a big vinyl aficionado, and he collected, he had very broad tastes, and he was into his jazz as well. And they had this basement area downstairs in the house that was just given over to music. It was like, I think Richard even put a notice when he was a bit younger saying Richie's Music Corner. And they used to hang out in the basement listening to and kind of deconstructing records all the time. And jazz was a big part of it. And that was obviously part of their very first incarnation as the Richard Carpenter Trio.
Somebody says, I can't remember who it is now, they said, drummers are like hockey goalies. No one knows how to talk to them apart from another drummer. And I thought that was a really interesting point. But was that one of the things that, because there were quite a lot of them that set her apart from other people, her sort of tomboyishness and also just being a girl drummer? I mean, that wasn't something that a lot of people could connect with.
I think that's really true. And again, that was something that fascinated me as I was exploring the story, was this kind of argot that her own very unique language that she adopted, that was sort of a little bit bebop, a little bit beatnik, and shortening everybody's names in a way that was quite irreverent and peculiar to her. And she used to hang out in this place called Studio City, which was a big drum store in LA. And mostly on a Saturday afternoon, it would just be full of guys, but she would be there just, hanging out, having conversations. She studied with a jazz drummer, a guy called Bill Douglas. And I just think, God, she really was a tomboy. This was her world, a world that she was comfortable in. And that was her. And that really stood out in terms of the time. You're thinking kind of 1960s, when female drummers were quite rare.
Who were those female? There's Honey Lantry of the Honeycombs. That's about it. Motuck. Well, Motuck was probably a bit later.
Motuck until a little bit later. So really, there was no one around at the time. Viola Smith, 1930s drummer who used to play in some of the big bands. But on the whole, Karen really was out on her own there a bit from that time.
So when she starts, but the thing that really makes her stand out when they start getting in the fringes of the music business is her voice, isn't it?
Yes,
absolutely. Because Joe Osborne one of the bass players of the legendary Wrecking Crew, the Los Angeles studio session musicians, he fastened upon her quite quickly, didn't he? He did a lot of work with her early on. And one of the interesting things to me is it wasn't easy for them to get into the music business, was it really? Even though people recognized that she had an extraordinary instrument.
That's right. So she did, and she released a couple of singles on Joe Osborne's Magic Lamp label that sort of disappeared without trace. It was just, maybe 500 copies of the single. And she and Richard were part of this outfit called Spectrum that was like a quite complex vocal harmony group, also multi-instrumentals, and people just didn't know what to do with them, basically. They didn't slot into any kind of nice, easy, they weren't particularly psychedelic, they weren't particularly rock. And yes, they were definitely had a sense of easy listening, but that was still in its infancy. That whole genre was really in its infancy. And it wasn't until Herb Albert from A&M heard their demos, and suddenly he had the vision of how, yes, I know what we can do with them, and kind of steering them towards.
So what was it that he did with them, or that was done with them? It was just really good, simple songs, wasn't it?
Yes. Yeah. And I think he, first and foremost, he loved her voice, and he thought, I've just got to have, he's a musician's musician, really. And so he was like, let's find the right context for her voice and the right way to sell this. And he was the one that kind of pushed Burt Bacharach's song "Close to You," and he was very hands-on with the recording session and kind of helping them structure that. Obviously it was Richard and Karen with the vocal arrangements, and but I think it was maybe Herb Albert's idea to bring in the flugelhorn, and but then that was a hunch. That was his hunch, and Herb Albert said before they released it, this could either go really well or it could fall flat on its face. But luckily, it turned into rocketed to.
Well, it made them, didn't it? That was a huge hit. Exactly. It's just interesting. David and I were talking about this. I think Hal Blaine was at that session. I think he plays drums on that from the Wrecking Crew, and he talked about her mum was at the session too, and how incredibly controlling her mum was. Her mum's simultaneously complaining about the fact that she's not being allowed to play drums, but also insisting that Richard is the star and all that. Yes, and it made me think, that must have been incredibly unusual for someone. She wasn't the manager or anything. She wasn't there in an official capacity. How did Karen feel about her mother being at those sessions? I mean, that's a very different situation.
So I think for Karen, the parents were, we'd use the term helicopter parent these days, wouldn't we?
Yeah.
The parents were literally, they were still living at home with their parents, even after the first few albums.
When they're 23 and 26. I think Chris Charlesworth of the Melody Maker goes to interview them and finds they are literally living at home, aren't they?
Well, the cover of Now and Then, which is one of their biggest albums, is the outside of the family home, isn't it?
Yes, that's right. And I thought this was quite funny. It gets to a point where Richard and Karen are like, Mum and Dad, maybe it is time, you should think about moving out. And they literally bought them a new house, but Mum and Dad just dug their heels in and refused to leave because they were obviously just enjoying the family all still being together. So Richard and Karen just moved into the house instead. So yes, I think it was quite claustrophobic for Karen. Actually, her mother was a very dominant influence, and it was claustrophobic for her, particularly when she wanted to leave home and move into her own apartment, and her mum threw a wobbly, like calling her a traitor. There was a lot of pressure. For some reason, it was very important for Agnes Carpenter to kind of keep the family really locked in together.
Well, there are so many instances of how kind of chaperone she is. There's a bit where she meets Elvis Presley. I think she's with Petula Clark. And Elvis starts flirting with her. And Pet Clark immediately whisks her out of the room for her own safety. I think she was about, 21, 22 or something at the time. No. She could clearly look after herself. And Elvis flirting with you might have been something she was quite interested in.
Well, actually, yeah, no, and looking at and thinking about that, I think Karen was probably quite interested in Elvis. And if Petula Clark hadn't been there, then maybe she would have got off with him. Yes, no, there was this sense that they were a lot of wanting to protect the songbird. And so I think that's why we're kind of left with this cultural image of Karen as being quite fragile, maybe a bit of a victim. And I was surprised to find out how tough she was and how
Yeah.
resilient, despite her terrible eating disorder and what she struggled with there. In terms of her music, in terms of what she wanted to do, she had, she was very determined, and she had really, really strong ideas.
But there's always there's a problem with the drums, isn't there? It's the largest piece of equipment on stage, and therefore, if you have a tendency to hide, that's the place to go and hide, because there's the most stuff between you and the audience. Do you think she felt that? Because, as far as anybody was concerned, in normal showbiz, if you've got a fabulous singer, you put them out the front.
Yes. And certainly that's the model. But I think that proved, to be honest, I think that was pretty disastrous for her because of her. She said that when she was, they put a lot of pressure on her management, Richard, the record company, to step out from behind the drums and just kind of stand up front. And she said that she felt petrified at that point. She felt incredibly exposed. And in a way, she was being de-skilled.
Well, also, she must have lost her identity to some extent, because that's what she was known as.
It's also the key knack of the lead singer of any kind is having the nerve to stand out front on your own without anything.
Yes.
And that's a really tough thing to do at any level.
Yes, and it was very tough for her. And it does strike me, talking to a lot of female artists, singers, they find that's the part. There is parts of that part of the job they find really challenging. The fact that they're under such scrutiny, and I think you have to be incredibly emotionally healthy and robust to withstand that.
Because
that's the thing. It's a combination of sensitivity and toughness, isn't it? To stand on stage in front of people takes a certain amount of toughness.
Yes,
not everybody has it, and it doesn't always go along with the talent.
No.
Sometimes happens.
And to have people reviewing you, and I think that in those days, sometimes it makes me laugh when I look at some of the reviews. Were so insensitive, reviewing her outfits and her figure, and no wonder it would, give someone a complex.
Yeah, well, absolutely. If you got body image issues, being an entertainer in front of people, is the most terrible place to be, because you can see it in the audience's eyes, regardless of what you read in the paper the following day or whatever. So that she was in a terrible, terrible state with that. So when did that start to manifest itself, within the Carpenter story?
She did feel self-conscious. So around 1974, when they were stepping up the touring, and they were very busy and touring not just in America but globally as well. And Karen started to get very self-conscious about how she came across on TV or photographs or whatever, and she really started to get into this strong dieting and exercising regime. Was very particular about, I'm just going to have a salad, thanks, and my iced tea, and that's it. And I talked to Rebecca Siegel, who was their tour manager from those 1974-75 tours, and she said that after a while she noticed that Karen was losing weight and more weight, and she noticed that before the show, when the whole band was sitting having supper, Karen would be artfully pushing her food around her plate and talking very animatedly, but not eating anything. And Rebecca said, I felt like I needed to tell somebody, look, she's not eating. But she said at that time there was a culture of silence. There was no understanding of eating disorders, anorexia, and no sense of, as she put it, the slippery slope that she was on.
And this wasn't helped, presumably, by, there's quite a lot in the book about their image, and there's a moment where they go and to make a charity donation at the White House and meet Nixon, and this is just during the Vietnam War, and it's rumours of Watergate have already happening. And so all those kind of associations must have been incredibly bad. They kicked Neil Sedaka, I think, off one of their tours.
Yes,
And immediately for upstaging them, And this is because the press just go absolutely mental just about how kind of unfashionable, how square they are. So that must have been part of her psychological problem too, I guess.
And I think she was quite stung by that because... And I noticed that so it's funny, isn't it? In Britain, we're very comfortable with pop music, and we've got that, maybe going right back from the Beatles onwards. We've got a real appreciation and a love of pop music, and we don't find it complicated. But in America, there was such a divide between what they call the top 40 radio and more alternative sounds and rock, and the two seem very polarized, even within A&M Records itself. So some of the staff felt quite ambivalent about the Carpenters and what they were working on with the Carpenters. And I think both Richard and Karen got very frustrated with the way that they were consistently portrayed as white bread, goody two-shoes.
Yeah.
Karen in particular, because, and again, looking into it, I think that wasn't really her. There was so much more to her. And then when she got the opportunity to do some solo work, it's interesting that she went into a very different direction.
Well, then she's the final solo album that she made was a really major moment, wasn't it? Because it was shelved, wasn't it? Tell us what happened there. She had a huge budget to make this record, and then they didn't like it and wouldn't put it out.
Yes. So at first, A&M were really behind it, and it was quite exciting. And she went over to New York, and she was working with Phil Ramone. She was working with Billy Joel's backing band. I had some lovely interviews with those guys like Liberty DeVito, really straight-talking Italian American, and they got on with her. They had quite a kind of, earthy humour, but she enjoyed that, and she enjoyed exploring a different side to herself, different kind of working with more soul music. Before she went, Richard said to her, "Don't do disco," so of course she goes and does disco on some tracks. There was a sense of her branching out and maybe, becoming slightly more rebellious. And, the woman's allowed to. I mean, she was kind of coming up to her 30th birthday. So I think she really was beginning to wanting to stretch as an artist. So the fact that A&M refused to put out the album because they didn't really understand it, and it didn't fit in with the whole Carpenters narrative, which by then was such a huge juggernaut, she suffered. And I think she felt after that, she felt quite devastated.
Has that record ever come out?
It did come out in the late 90s, mid-90s.
Oh, did it? Okay, I'm going to say.
I think eventually, yeah.
It would do, sure.
Absolutely.
Yeah. So it's now, so it came out in 96.
Right.
And now you can hear she was moving into a whole new direction, and talking to some of the musicians, arrangers who worked on the album, people like Bob James, he said this was the start of a new journey that had she survived, had she been more healthy, he believed she would have had a great solo career alongside of the Carpenters.
The crowning tragedy in the personal life is the marriage.
Oh, my Lord.
Which is just,
yes,
it's a nightmare.
Give us
she marries a guy
for that.
She
marries a guy on a blind date, doesn't she?
So she goes on a blind date, and it's this guy called Tom Burris, who's a real estate developer, inverted commas, who apparently had never heard of the Carpenters.
They always say that.
Yeah. That might have been quite an attractive thing in a weird way, actually. But anyway.
Well, yes, I think it probably tickled her. But you kind of think 1980, we've had 10 years of like number one and number two hits. How, has he been living under a rock? And he sweet talked her, and within 3 months was proposing, kind of really rushing her into marriage. So, of course, everyone around her, their antennae went up, like, who's this guy? But she so wanted to be married. She so wanted to have children, and that's the really sad thing about this. That she got married. And
I thought she discovered 3 days beforehand that A, he had a 19-year-old son, and B, that he had a vasectomy.
Oh, yes.
Wasn't that was just 3 days before the marriage, wasn't it?
Yes. Oh, and this is the kind of thinking about her mother, Agnes. She went to her mother and said, "Well, he's been lying. He's had this vasectomy, and I want to have children. And what the hell am I going to do? And I don't want to get married to him." And Agnes is, "You made your bed, now you lie in it."
Oh, God. No, yeah.
It was
We
almost
booked
like,
the coronation chicken. We got the table fancies. That's right.
We've got the photographers coming.
Oh, God.
Wow.
It's just that.
Yeah.
By then, she was lost in showbiz, wasn't she? Really, it was. You're committed to doing it.
Yes.
It's
And they'd even gone so far as to record, and it's not one of my favorite tracks, is that kind of wedding song.
Yes.
And hiring a whole orchestra, and oh
dear. Yeah. You have to strip that stuff away. So, what was, what's so special about her in your view, summing it all up?
So summing it up, I think her voice is just absolutely remarkable, and it's so full of emotion, and it communicates intense feeling, love, romance, pain, everything, but quite restrained at the same time. So she never overdoes it. It has a resonance that stays with you. And the other thing is her drumming is brilliant. You listen to some of early albums, and there's some really out there tracks like Another Song, which I think is on the second album, where she just goes into this complete drum break and improvisation at the end. And with such skill and kind of joie de vivre, you can't help being taken along with it. So I think as a performer and as a singer, really unequaled.
Do you think that her life story affected people's appreciation of the music? Do you think in some ways that they're not as recognised as they should be because people find that it hard to disassociate it from that terrible element of tragedy?
Yeah, and I think, in a way, that's partly why I did the book, because I thought that her tragic passing has really dominated how we view her and how we see her, and it does. It makes it very sad, but I do feel like enough time has elapsed now. It's 40 years ago since she died.
Yeah, she died in 83. It's amazing. Yeah.
I feel now maybe we can just appreciate her voice and what her gift to the world is, what I say. I mean, and it sounds a bit corny, but that's how I felt. That's really how I felt it. And I kind of feel like in a way, there is, I feel like she's free. She's free, and her voice has survived, and it's there moving people. It's there kind of inspiring us. I put a little chapter at the end about my trip to LA and going to the old A&M recording studios, and the lovely Fariel, who kind of organises the studios there, and she took me into Studio B, and she'd sort of put these candles on and lit these candles, and she got the engineer to play a song for you. And it was such a remarkable experience to be in that studio listening to something that was recorded there. It was like an echo of an echo. It was so powerful, getting the atmosphere of where they'd recorded.
Well, there's the book, Lead Sister, The Story of Karen Carpenter by Lucy O'Brien, out now.